why, in a moment, why I think this is the richest point of entry into the law. But that, in summary, is the claim, the methodological claim of the book, that an anthropological analysis of law and policy yields the deepest understanding, positions the individual best to understand why the law is the way it is, and to measure its success. Both in terms of the fit between the mechanisms of the law and the aims of the law and the anthropology that underlie those aims, but also even allows us to ask questions, as I do in the book, about whether or not the first order principles about who we are, what we owe to each other, and what constitutes our flourishing are fully consonant with our lived reality, our lived experience, and therefore does it ground law in a way that's suitable to our needs and aspirations and protection, for that matter. So the substantive claim of the book is that when you subject what I call the three vital conflicts of American public bioethics, the law pertaining to abortion, the law, really the absence of law in the American context, touching and concerning assisted reproductive technologies, and the laws relating to end-of-life decision-making and assisted suicide, what you find is the dominant anthropology that undergirds all of these particular areas is incomplete and inadequate, and it tracks and closely resembles what social scientists and philosophers have described as expressive individualism. And I'll spend some time this evening talking about what I mean by that and explaining why I think it is an inadequate foundation. While it does certainly capture some truths about us, our experience, and our identities, it's not the whole truth, and it's not the whole truth about many of the populations who are uniquely vulnerable and at risk in the context of public bioethics, both historically as well as at present. And I'm thinking of children, the elderly, and the disabled in particular. So it's a vision, expressive individualism. It's an anthropology that can't and doesn't make sense of the lived reality of human embodiment, our vulnerability, our reciprocal indebtedness and dependence on one another, and our natural limits, and thus is not a fit foundation for public bioethics. And then I also offer some broad-based normative proposals about how to fill out the anthropology that's defective with the more true-to-life account, as well as focusing on and discussing the what's needed for the genuine flourishing and protection of embodied beings in time, as we all are. Okay, so the framework for the talk is fairly straightforward. I'll begin by defining public bioethics. I will offer an explanation of what I mean by this anthropological analysis of law and policy. I'll give you an account of and a critique of expressive individualism. And then I will make some general statements, offer some general reflections on what might be a useful anthropological corrective. That is, how to think about ourselves or the subjects and the objects of law in a way that's closer to our lived reality and therefore more suitable to constructing laws and policies that are fully responsive to our needs, especially in our vulnerability. And I'll discuss the goods, practices, and virtues that are necessary to shore up what's needed for our flourishing. And there probably won't be enough time to get into, one of the three case studies that I take up in the book. If there is time, or if you wish to, in fact, I'll stop there. And if folks want to talk about the case study of assisted reproductive technology, we can circle back to it. Or if people prefer, we could focus on the other areas, abortion, end-of-life decision-making, or for that matter, we don't have to talk about any concrete public policy areas. We could dwell on the deeper, more theoretical parts of the argument. Entirely up to my interlocutors, up to the audience. So let's start then with public bioethics. What is meant by public bioethics? And I've already said that public bioethics is the governance. So it's not, bioethics is a field of intellectual inquiry that relates to the ethical questions that arise from advances in biomedical science and biotechnology. Whereas public bioethics concerns the point at which the law and public policy come into contact with those issues and those questions. It's the governance of science, medicine, and biotechnology in the name of ethical goods. It's the work of state legislatures. It's the work of the US Congress, of administrative agencies, of the Supreme Court, of the lower federal courts. And it's also the work that we do in private ordering in those spaces that the law the law creates for us, or that the law leaves to us, however you would like to describe it, which is also something that we should discuss when we're thinking about the effects of law on public policy. Because, as I say, in the book itself, the proposals that I make are framed at a pretty high level of abstraction. They mostly focus on the purposes and ends to which we should be striving, rather than concrete, granular legal proposals. And I think there's a lot more thinking that I would like to do on those matters. And maybe we can think together tonight a little bit about how to operationalize these theoretical claims in our pluralistic country. But there is, of course, the possibility that that the best way to resolve these matters is to have robust spaces for private ordering through civil society, through our own individual decision making, and so on. We can get into that as we move forward. One of the observations that I make, though, that's important about public bioethics is, historically and again at present, public bioethics, the law and policies in this space, are fundamentally concerned with human vulnerability, human dependence, frailty, and finitude. It's about procreation and pregnancy, babies, wasting illnesses, devastating injuries, desperate enrollees in clinical trials, fearful patients, the disabled, the elderly, the dying, and the dead. And of course, living through the global pandemic, there's a whole host of questions. Maybe we'll talk about some of them in terms of how the arguments that I'm making here, how the sort of anchoring laws and policies in what I take to be a more complete and true to life anthropology, or account of who we are and what our flourishing is, what that might mean for public health interventions in a global pandemic. Access to vaccines, how to distribute the burdens and benefits of public health in that difficult context. But the fundamental point, taking a step back, is that public bioethics is most deeply about the meaning and consequences of human embodiment. It's about the fact that we experience ourselves, one another, and the world around us in and as living and dying bodies. And any anthropology that will match our lived experience and respond to our genuine needs in all of their fullness must take our embodiment as an intrinsic and unavoidable and inexorable feature of our identity into account. So, American public bioethics was born in the United States in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And in the book, I take three signal examples of events, some of which most people have heard of, one of which is less commonly known. The three events that gave rise to the reaction, the legislative reaction, the executive branch reaction, in some cases the judicial reaction, that formed the core of public bioethics and put in place a paradigm that is pretty well followed even to this day. The three events are, first of all, publication by Henry K. Beecher, Harvard anesthesiologist, of a fairly unremarkably titled piece, but Ethics in Clinical Research, that came out in New England Journal of Medicine in 1966. It was a bombshell. Beecher had always been interested in human subjects protections. He'd always been interested in abuses of human subjects in the context of biomedical research. He was a careful student of the Nuremberg experience and the prosecution of the Nazi so-called doctors. And he decided to study what the experience in the United States was. And he examined, I think, 22 different research experimental protocols, so experimentation involving human subjects, sponsored by the most elite and eminent members of the biomedical and scientific communities. The U.S. government was one sponsor, and some of these, Ivy League schools, esteemed institutes of research. And what he found was quite shocking, both to him and to the public, and to the both the lay public as well as the scientific community. What he found was, even operating at the very highest level, and certainly with the well-meaning intentions of the sponsors of this research and those who were conducting the research, that there was quite a bit of shocking exploitation of individuals, vulnerable individuals, by researchers. And all but, I think, two of these cases, there was no mention of securing informed consent. And in many of the instances, it wouldn't have been possible to do so. certainly not from the subject, perhaps from a proxy, but even in those cases, that didn't actually happen. The most shocking examples, to me at least, was the intentional injection of hepatitis into intellectually disabled children at an institution called Willowbrook in Staten Island, and also injection of live cancer cells into patients, many of whom are suffering from senile dementia, in the New York Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital. This sent sort of shockwaves through the American public and the scientific establishment, that even the most esteemed and eminent individuals who are conducting this research and the most elite journals, which rely on peer review and even an ethical analysis, published the work as well. And it was a kind of wake-up call, really, for the United States, and it captured the attention not just of the scientific community and the lay public, but also of Congress, as I'll elaborate on more in a moment. There were hearings, actually early hearings convened by Walter Mondale in the 60s to talk about biomedical ethics. They sort of foundered, but then Senator Ted Kennedy picked the gauntlet up in the early 1970s, and then was successful in a series of hearings that culminated in the National Research Act of 1974, which I'll talk about in a second. But Beecher was the first signal moment. The second signal moment was the report in the shocking and scandalous report in the Washington Daily News of a 40-year-long experiment conducted by the United States Public Health Service in Macon County, Alabama, and Tuskegee, Alabama. I'm from Alabama, on experimentation on research involving a community of very poor, mostly uneducated African-American sharecroppers in Macon County, Alabama, which at the time had one of the highest instances and highest concentrations of syphilis infection in the country. And what the researchers wanted to do, for those of you who are not familiar, most everyone probably is familiar, wanted to study the natural history of the disease untreated in this population to see what its consequences were. The researchers never advised these men and women why they were studying them. They never told them what was happening. They told them that they were being treated for bad blood. They deceived them intentionally. And most shocking of all, in the 1940s, when antibiotics became standard of care for syphilis, they did not give anyone access to those antibiotics. They wanted to see the disease run its course. And in fact, there's some reports that seem credible that they colluded with the local health authorities in Macon County, Alabama, to prevent them from actually getting access to treatment that would have prevented the terrible ravages of the disease, or at least mitigated the terrible ravages of the disease. This was a shocking development. Again, Congress convened hearings. Senator Kennedy convened hearings and folded this particular question in to the matters under consideration. And even there were special dedicated hearings separately that were entirely dedicated to the Tuskegee scandal. A lot of people have heard of Beecher. A lot of people have heard of the Tuskegee scandal. Not many people, at least in my experience, have heard about the third signal event. The third signal event was a report by Victor Cohn in the Washington Post that the NIH had begun debating and discussing the possibility of funding research of American researchers who would travel abroad to Scandinavia, who would make arrangements with abortion providers in Scandinavia, who were performing a particular abortion procedure that resulted in the delivery of a live, intact newborn. They would basically perform a C-section, remove the newborn, and the newborn would effectively expire as a result of no longer being attached to his or her mother. And the researchers thought that this was a unique opportunity for study because they could test drugs, they could test devices, they could do a whole host of things. They study circulation by making arrangements to work with these abortion providers, and they would perform the C-section. The baby would be delivered, and the baby would be imminently dying because in most instances, perhaps all instances, the baby was not capable of living independently outside of his or her mother's womb. But they were intact, and you could do all sorts of invasive experimentation. These scientists did just that. In fact, it was reported that some of their interventions prolonged the life of these babies outside of their mother's body, sometimes connected by an umbilical cord still, even to the tune of hours. It was reported in some places. And this was a shocking development. And it's interesting, the politics is interesting because Eunice Shriver, Ted Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, and John F. Kennedy's sister, married to Sergeant Shriver, of course, who founded the Peace Corps, among other things, and the Special Olympics, for that matter. She was shocked by this report. And her daughter, Maria Shriver, who was 17 at the time, later became First Lady of California, was also a highly acclaimed journalist as well. Organized her local Catholic school in the DC suburbs to go to the NIH and protest this research and to protest the possibility, perhaps probability, that NIH either had funded it or was planning on funding it. And I think possibly in no small part due to the political influence of the Kennedy family, the NIH said, "Wait, we're not going to do this. This is if we were doing it, we're going to stop." I think they might have denied having funded this research. I think the record is a little unclear as to what actually happened. And then so this question of research on a still living neonate, still living newborn who had just been aborted but was imminently dying, became a central question in the hearings that Senator Kennedy convened. So he convenes these hearings, and it culminates in the National Research Act, which did a variety of things. It imposed a moratorium on live neonate research following an abortion, or for that matter, live fetal research, live in utero interventions as well as ex utero interventions by physicians, federally funded physicians. And but it also created the National Commission for Bioethics, and that was a body that was charged by statute with creating the policies for human subjects protections, but also elaborating the ethical principles that should govern these areas. And in fact, their statutory authority was to send recommendations to the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, which is now the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and the Secretary was to accept and implement these recommendations, or had the obligation to put in writing why he or she would not follow the instructions. And in their report, they issued a report on live fetal research. They issued a report called the Belmont Report, a very famous report articulating the principles of biomedical ethics, which have gotten a lot of traction and purchase not just in the United States, but around the world. And as they've evolved, the chief principle, it was originally framed in the Belmont Report as respect for persons. In its later iterations, especially through the work of philosophers at Georgetown who were highly influential, really autonomy became the primary principle. Safeguard and respect for, and mechanisms to respect autonomy were the principal safeguards against the kinds of abuses that occasioned these hearings and this statute. So if you look back on American public bioethics in its kind of historical narrative, what you find is a few things. First of all, it's very complex, right? You've got the seamless integration of great goods with serious and grave risks. I believe that the Public Health Service folks in Tuskegee meant it when they said, when confronted about it, that they didn't intend any harm to these poor sharecroppers. They just didn't think that they weren't making their circumstances worse, because due to their socioeconomic circumstances, due to systemic racism and all the other deep problems that those poor folks were confronted with at that time, that they wouldn't have gotten access to antibiotics anyway. And so they were effectively just observing a process that they didn't choose or create. They simply didn't help. Similar argument was actually made in the hearings by the researchers who were going to Scandinavia to work on these babies who had just been aborted, who were still alive but imminently dying, saying, well, we didn't cause these abortions to take place. The abortions were chosen for reasons that were separate and distinct from our purposes. We just happened to, coordinate with the researchers, and we thought that we could bring some benefit out of this possibly tragic situation by doing some biomedical research on these newborns, these dying newborns. Now, of course, in many instances, the interventions themselves caused the death of the newborns. And so it wasn't merely passively observing and not helping. It was actually in those instances the direct killing of these newborns as part of the research protocol. And in response to those lines of argument, by the way, Andre Helgers, who was the first, I think he was the first director of the Kennedy Institute of Ethics at Georgetown, said, well, just because a person is in a tragic circumstance or is doomed to die in any event, that doesn't give us the right to exploit them again and to make their death the object of our intention for the sake of our own interests. Just because a person is poor or victim of systemic racism, or because a person is imminently dying, it doesn't give us the right to bring about their demise in the name of the good that is more important to us. That was the line of argument back and forth in the Congress at the time. But these are integrated goods and risks, and the technologies and the interventions are, of course, by their nature neutral, right? It all depends on both the intentions as well as the consequences of the behavior of the people involved. They're obviously bitterly contested matters, right? They're concerned with the nature, meaning, and consequences of birth, life, death, procreation, parenthood, childhood, race, poverty, illness, scientific freedom, autonomy, dignity, equality, and justice. It squarely and unavoidably poses the question of who are we and what do we owe to each other. And it, in fact, involves, what I refer to in the book and others have referred to as vital conflicts, zero-sum matters of life and death, the contours and boundaries of the moral and legal community. And finally, one thing that we see a recurring theme in American public bioethics is frequently we try to take refuge in our laws and policies into constructing the protections in autonomy is the principal grounding good, right? And that itself is the kind of clue, sort of glimmer, or give some insight into what the underlying anthropology is. If the good of autonomy is the principal good that we're trying to vindicate, what does that say about what we think a person is and what human flourishing is? The issues are very broad. The issues that I take up in the book, as I've said several times now, are abortion, assisted reproduction, and end-of-life decision-making. So now, what on earth does law have to do with anthropology in the way that I mean it, not in the way of, again, modern academic discipline, Margaret Mead going to faraway islands to report on the practices and habits of distant peoples? What I mean is quite literally an account of what it means to be human, right? What is our flourishing? And Walker Percy, one of my favorite novelists, famously said that everyone has an anthropology. There's no not having an anthropology. If a man or woman says that they don't, all they're saying is that their anthropology is implicit. It's a set of assumptions that he or she is not thought to call into question. And we teach our students at Notre Dame Law School that law is intrinsically and inexorably morally laden. That is, laws always have to do with goods to be pursued and harms to be avoided. And the richest account of a law, before you get to the anthropological level of analysis, is what are the goods this law means to serve, what are the harms it means to avoid, or what principle of justice is reflected in this law, what concept of human freedom is animating this legal framework, what principle of equality is driving the law in this context. But law also, because it's morally laden, both reflects the goods that a particular people hold dear and the harms that they seek to avoid. So you can learn a lot about a given people by looking at their legal framework. You can learn a lot about asking, what do they reward? What behaviors do they incentivize? What behaviors do they surveil? What behaviors do they forbid? What behaviors do they adopt a posture of neutrality on, allowing private ordering and private decision-making to be the principal driver of action? You can learn a lot because law reflects the normative commitments of a given community. But law also, for better or worse, shapes attitudes and understanding about goods and harms. Law, in fact, does have a rich pedagogical function in, again, for better or worse. I mean, we would do better not to simply take our bearings on morality and justice from what is lawful, what is not lawful, what's funded, what's prohibited, what's et cetera. I mean, it's an important teacher. It's certainly not the only teacher. But at a level deeper still, because law, and this is really the fundamental point, right, of the methodology, because law is about and for the protection and flourishing of persons. That's what law is for. It's for the protection and flourishing of persons, both individually and collectively. That means that we have to have an ex ante or a prior understanding or set of premises about what a human being is and what human flourishing is, about not just who counts as a person, although that's an important question, but among the population of individuals we recognize as persons, what are they? What is their flourishing? What are their needs? And so what do we owe to one another? And so because all law is unavoidably grounded in a usually unstated account of what it means to be a human being, we do well in analyzing the law to try to inductively, that is taking the law as we find it, dig into that foundation and surface who and what the law assumes a person to be. And what I found when I did that in the Vital Conflicts of American Public Bioethics, what I found is what Robert Bellah, author of Habits of the Heart in 1985, or Charles Taylor, philosopher from McGill University, and after a fashion, Alistair McIntyre, my colleague and next door neighbor at the Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture, or even Michael Sandel in his own way at Harvard University, is the anthropology of expressive individualism. And we don't need to spend time on the genealogy of expressive individualism, where it comes from, how it kind of both in the book, I break it down and talk about all the different individualisms. There are multiple individualisms that have been offered, and there have been interesting disputations and on those points. And expressivism itself is, and again, not all individualism is expressive individualism, right? There's utilitarian individualism, as Bellah describes it, where individuals pursuing their own goods in a well-regulated system of laws produces the greatest net benefit for a given community. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is expressive individualism, which defines flourishing as the interrogation of the interior of the self. It takes the individual as the fundamental unit of reality, abstracted from his or her context, abstracted from his her web of relationships to family or to tradition or to community or to nation or to whatever social role one might inhabit. Abstracted from that, and then defines flourishing not in terms of any constitutive commitments or ties, but rather defines flourishing in terms of the interrogation, the practice of interrogating the interior of the self to find one's own authentic truth, one's own original truth, which is sometimes transgressive of the mores of the society in which a person happens to be in, to express those authentic truths, and then to configure your life accordingly, and to pursue your life plan as you see fit in a way that realizes your identity and expresses your true identity. And again, I won't read this, but there's a fantastic passage in Paradise Lost in which Lucifer, addressing all the other fallen angels and addressing God and denying his creaturely status, really is a kind of expressive individualist par excellence. Can't remember his creaturely status, can't remember being a creature, has no obligation to a creator, and only recalls himself as he is now. His power is his own, his will is his own, and that is what is definitive and morally definitive in terms of framing his actions and his choices to rebel against his creator. But expressive individualism, and by the way, in romantic literary movement, romantic poetry, and Mozart and Goethe, you see a lot of expressive individualism. There was a kind of in the artistic world, there was a reaction to harmony and linearity that was sort of a precursor to what becomes much more commonly held, that Robert Bellah measured and observed in Habits of the Heart in the United States, where common people pursue their own flourishing through this precise lens as well. It conceives of the person as an isolated, unencumbered, atomized self. The person is defined exclusively and solely by the will But that makes sense, right? Because the idea is that the will is the thing that is the mechanism of one's flourishing, discovering one's unique truths inside and expressing them and pursuing it and imposing your will, your unencumbered will, and to bend everything around you in order to produce those outcomes. Everything else is instrumental. The will is who we really are. So it's dualistic in philosophical terms. It prioritizes the will and therefore cognition, and the body itself and our relationships and nature and everything else are instrumental to pursuing the projects of the will. Persons are defined as an individual chooser or consumer. Human flourishing, as I've already said, is the produce of projects of one's own construction. The imperative is to live one's own originality. You are, in Michael Sandel's words, a self-originating source of valid claims. It is anti-teleological, meaning that it does not take the external givens of the physical world or physical experience as normative or even a useful guide to what our future directed plans might be. Only the unique and original inner voice is definitive in this way. And it doesn't regard or doesn't recognize any unchosen obligations or constitutive attachments. The obligations that we have are the obligations that we freely agree to in advance, and things become quite transactional. Personal relationships are instrumental and transactional. Familial relationships are instrumental and transactional. And persons, again, it's a universe of isolated, atomized wills, sometimes coming together to collaborate and to pursue mutually beneficial goals. When those alignment of ends or alignment of purposes are no longer true, then they come apart. But also, it's a world of strife, where atomized individual wills have to overbear one another in order to find their own truth, to live their own truth. Let's put it that way. And a very limited view of ethical goods. Autonomy is the highest good to which all others are subordinated. And injustice through this frame is really seen as a constraint on freedom to pursue the projects of one's own choosing. And if one were to sort of spin out a view of the role of government from this anthropology, it really becomes the fundamental purpose is to remove those constraints, the public constraints, the private constraints, perhaps even natural constraints, and otherwise provide people with the conditions for the assertion of the unencumbered self. Now, this is a very, let's say, attractive vision, right? For those of us who are privileged, for those of us who are accomplished, for those of us who are operating at the height of our cognitive powers, those of us who are wealthy, this is an appealing image, right? The idea of the lonely, atomized will finding and living his own original truth in the universe, which might include collaboration with others, it might not. It's an attractive image, right? And it captures something that's true about us. It captures that we are particular individual selves. We do have human freedom, I think. But it misses something very deep about our humanity, and for that reason is an unfit sole grounding for laws and policies that relate to bioethics, because what it misses is the entailments of our embodiment, right? The fact that we are bodies, that we experience ourselves as bodies, we come into the world as bodies, we are living bodies, we are dying bodies, we encounter one another as bodies, and as corruptible, fragile bodies in time, everyone has certain consequences. First of all, is that we're vulnerable, right? We're vulnerable to age, we're vulnerable to illness, we're vulnerable to violence, we're vulnerable to poverty, we're vulnerable to a whole wide variety of things, right? And as such, we are mutually dependent upon one another. We actually have to take care of each other if we're going to survive. If you're if you're an embodied being in time, you have to take care of one another. And of course, we're subject to natural limits. And McIntyre says, and he reminds us that optimally we begin life utterly dependent on our parents, and then we have this sort of arc of development towards independence, and then hopefully we have a steady decline, but then we find ourselves back again dependent on others. That's the best case scenario, by the way, right? Many of us will experience moments in our lives where our flourishing is disrupted and we become radically dependent on people again. We see this in the global pandemic. And McIntyre puts it this way. He says, all human beings exist on a scale of disability, and the needs and the gifts of shared embodied life, what you need if you are an embodied being, first of all, and I'll spend a little more time on this in a moment, what you really need to survive and flourish are what McIntyre calls networks of unconditional and uncalculated giving and graceful receiving. Networks made up of people who are willing to make others good, their own good, without hope for getting something in return. And the sort of most paradigmatic example of this is the parent-child relationship, right? The parent does not, contrary to Judith Jarvis Thompson's argument in A Defense of Abortion in 1972, a parent does have obligations, I argue, by virtue of the relationship to the child. Now, they can discharge that obligation in different ways. You can make an adoption plan. You can, if we're talking about a newborn, an unplanned pregnancy in a newborn, or you can obviously rear the child and parent the child yourself. But the point is that the child doesn't have to earn the privilege to be cared for by the parents, and the parents don't take care of the child because they've agreed in advance in some contractual context to do so. It is by virtue of the relationship that unchosen obligations and unearned privileges flow in both directions. That's the most important thing that we need to survive and flourish. And I put it, the way I put it in the book is, by virtue of our embodiment, we're made for love and friendship. We are made to depend on these networks of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving. We depend on them there for literally for our survival, certainly at the beginning of our life, God willing, not too frequently before the end of our life, but for many people that will be the case. Some people are dependent their entire lives, right? They can never act independently because of some illness or a disability or injury. And so you need it for survival, but you also need it to learn how to become the thing that I argue we're supposed to be, which is a person who is capable of making the good of another his or her own good. But you need other people, and I won't belabor this, not just for our survival and our education and our flourishing. You need people even to understand who you are, right? We are narrative creating animals. We are dialogical animals. You can't give an account of who you are or what you're supposed to do, McIntyre says, unless you understand what stories you're part of. And and expressive individualism misses all this. It misses the reality of human mutual dependence. It doesn't recall or foresee past or future vulnerability. Juvenal was referring to certain social contract theorists, but said something that's equally applicable here. He said he's reminded of childless men who must have forgotten their childhood. It doesn't recognize the claim of unchosen obligations. It doesn't recall or repay debts, and it's intolerant of imperfection. And in the context of American public bioethics, when expressive individualism becomes the grounding anthropology, what we end up with is a field of view that cannot see a whole host of our brothers and sisters, those who are incapable of flourishing as defined by expressive individualism, children, the disabled, the elderly. They're hidden from view. You can't really even give an intelligible account of what they are if what a person is he or she who is capable of flourishing through the lens of expressive individualism. So what do we do? I mean, this is an incomplete and inadequate anthropological grounding for law and policy. What do? We have to remember the body. Alistair says that we become forgetful of the body. I argue that expressive individualism is forgetful of the body. We have to remember the body. We have to recognize and learn to participate in these networks of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving, necessary to sustain and flourish in our shared and embodied lives. We have to become the kind of people that can take care of others without condition. And that requires us to cultivate memory and moral imagination, to see the other to whom we owe a duty of care, who has a claim on us, even if we haven't chosen in advance to help that individual or that group. So McIntyre talks about the virtues of acknowledged dependence, and I expand this and add to it a little bit in the book. These are the virtues and goods and practices that are necessary for creating and sustaining networks of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving, which are essential for the flourishing of embodied beings, to respond to the needs of embodied beings and their vulnerability, their mutual dependence, and their subjection to natural limits. And so the virtues of uncalculated giving, drawing on McIntyre's work, are the virtue of just generosity, the virtue of being able to extend to another person the care and consideration that he or she is owed by virtue of common membership in the human family in proportion to their need. Hospitality is a welcoming virtue, to welcome the stranger, welcome the other, by virtue of the fact of his or her common humanity. Misericordia refers to making the suffering of another your own suffering. That is, accompanying another in his or her suffering. And this has obviously significant application in the context of biomedical ethics and medical practice, where the virtue is practiced in first of all trying to ameliorate suffering or to treat suffering, but if that's not possible, merely to accompany another in his or her suffering. And the virtues of graceful receiving are principally the virtue of gratitude, right? The virtue of gratitude, because we recognize and we remember that we were and are and will be again radically dependent on other people who make our good their good when we can do nothing for them. When we can't give them anything. There's no quid pro quo. It's simply someone's going to take care of us by virtue of the fact that because of a relationship that they have to us, not because of some prior agreement. And when one remembers that, and when one sees in the future that that's where we're headed as well, you feel grateful. You feel grateful, and you feel humble, right? And you feel the disposition to do the same for others as a fitting response. A fitting response in gratitude is to care for others the way you've been cared for, and the humility that comes along with this, realizing that our gifts and the care that we've received is not something that we ourselves have necessarily earned, although we certainly earn other things. That we didn't earn the right, our parents' care, right, as babies. That I think inclines us to be more generous with others who might have less than we do in terms of the natural distribution of gifts. And again, thinking about life as a gift, thinking about care as a gift, thinking about, and especially when we talk about bioethics, children as a gift and family as a gift, the appropriate posture towards a gift is gratitude, right? And openness to the unbidden, to use the phrase of Bill May and Michael Sandel, tolerance of imperfection, receiving a gift in that spirit, rather than thinking through the lens of rational mastery, thinking through the lens of manipulation, thinking through the lens of extraction, which is the lens of the unencumbered will, right? These habits of mind, these virtues encourage a recognition of solidarity, all common membership in the human family, the intrinsic equal dignity of everyone, regardless of what his or her capacities happen to be, and so on, and truthfulness. And under the auspices, all of these virtues of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving can be framed within the context of authentic friendship, making the good of another one's own. And practicing the virtues of acknowledged dependence are to engage in practices that take you outside of yourself, that draw your gaze up from the interior to the exterior, to look to try to serve the needs of others. And the paradigm for this, again, the paradigm par excellence, which matters a lot when we're talking about these other areas of the law, is parenthood, right? So let me just say one quick thing. I'm not going to get into this. We should stop and have conversation now. But the fundamental finding that I have when I turn this framework, this analytic framework, towards the concrete legal and policy areas of American law of abortion, assisted reproduction, and end-of-life decision-making, what I find is, and just to be clear, I'm not saying that the people involved view themselves through this lens of expressive individualism. I'm not making a claim about people who seek abortions, or people who perform abortions, or people who go to get treatment in an IVF clinic, or people who are seeking assistance in suicide. I'm not saying that those people view themselves through the lens of expressive individualism. In fact, quite the opposite. What I'm saying is the law, the legal configuration, you can see, takes as its idealized vision of the person that it's supposed to protect and whose flourishing it's supposed to advance through the lens of expressive individualism, when in fact, the people in those clinical contexts are not actually seeking to impose their unencumbered wills. In most instances, they're just looking for help, right? Like if a person goes to an IVF clinic, they're not going to an IVF clinic to assert their unencumbered will. They're not going there to try to use the techniques of assisted reproductive technologies to manufacture a product into which they pour their aspirations. What they want to be is be a parent, right? They want to be a parent when they when they seek this kind of care. But the law, the legal framework, defined primarily as the absence of law, doesn't take that into account and is not responsive to a person who feels betrayed by his or her body, who wants nothing more in the world than to be a parent, which, by the way, is a relationship. There's no parent without a child. That entails a relationship. And it's not just the relationship between parents and children, but it goes outward there, the family, the community, the nation, the government, the law. We all have obligations to come to the aid of a parent and a child, right? It's less clear when we look through the lens of expressive individualism what our obligations are to the atomized, unencumbered will, right? That's not, I mean, that's so the argument that I'm making essentially is, if you want to frame the law properly in this area, you have to begin by recognizing that the people involved are not atomized, unencumbered wills. It's not the case in the context of an abortion that you have two strangers fighting over scarce resources. That's not what that context is. What you have is a relationship like no other in our human experience of a mother and her unborn child, and a conflict and a crisis. And when you think about it as a crisis involving a mother and a child, that should sound the alarm bells for all of us, right? A mother and child in distress means we have to drop what we're doing and go help, right? And not just help until the baby's born, help after the baby is born. Create a network of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving around that family, beginning with the family itself and circulating outward to try to come to their aid. But if you atomize the players, what you end up with is a vision, a framing of strangers in a crisis, a zero-sum vital conflict over scarce resources, and the only solution is violence, right? Like that's and so that's the problem with the framing of the law of abortion through our Supreme Court jurisprudence. It's the problem with the way our assisted reproductive technology legal landscape is basically a Wild West that has no guardrails to protect patients from unscrupulous clinicians. It has no guardrails to protect people from their own weakness, right? In terms of sex selection. Most every IVF clinic in America offers sex selection, right? And I don't have to tell you who the principal beneficiaries of that are in terms of offspring. You know, we don't ask questions about the techniques and practices and how they might affect both mother and child in terms of their health and outcome, because we don't focus on it as a parent, a person trying to become a parent, which means that there's a child, which means that we have to think more comprehensively and we have to render aid in a more comprehensive way. And then finally, on the end of life decision-making point, people who go to the doctor generally are not going to assert their unencumbered will. A person who is suffering, who is having suicidal ideation, I'm sure there's a sliver of the human population of wealthy, probably white people who can, of sound mind, and make a decision to kill themselves and to do so for some reason that is fulfilling to them. But downstream, if you look at a population-wide level, when you legalize assisted suicide, you end up exposing the weakest and the most vulnerable population, the disabled, the elderly, discrete and insular minorities, and others, to very grave risks of fraud, abuse, mistake, and duress. But even the person who is having suicidal ideation, if you think this is just a person wanting to assert his or her unencumbered will, you're going to miss the fact that most people who have suicidal ideation, including those who have cancer, the primary folks that are seeking assisted suicide in the states that have legalized it, their suicidal ideation would be addressed with appropriate mental health care, right? Treatable depression, or better palliative care, better pain management, right? You're not asserting your unencumbered will if you're laboring under the coercive burdens of extreme pain or despair or treatable depression, or for that matter, an insurance company that won't pay for your medicine, or a family that makes you feel, or you feel for better or worse, like a burden. So the bottom line is, the argument is the anthropology assumed by the law is asymmetrical and in fact antithetical to what people need in these contexts, as well as what we owe to people in those contexts also. So I'll stop there. I apologize for going on so long, but that's the basic gist.
Thank you so much for these compelling ideas and your anthropology and the case for the body in public bioethics, Carter. Thank you very much.
That's my pleasure. Thank you.
Let's have some conversation. We'll have some conversation with our Northwestern scholars, which will be moderated by Rita Gitchell. Rita Lowry Gitchell, Thomas More Society Special Counsel, an attorney for 36 years, has been recognized by leading lawyers for her leadership in medical malpractice defense and alternative dispute resolution. Rita was the first female president of the National Lawyers Association, a national pro-life bar association. Rita serves as a mediator and arbitrator and serves as former chair of the Health Law Section of the DuPage County Bar Association. Rita has published law reviews in the DePaul Journal of Healthcare Law and articles in bar associations and in the Federalist Society. Rita has provided continuing legal medical education courses and worked with private clients and public organizations on legal issues involving alternative dispute resolution and issues in advanced reproductive technology, particularly with embryo fate decisions. Rita has been the author of briefs regarding human embryo in cases submitted to multiple states and the United States Supreme Court. Welcome, Rita. Thank you for being here.
I'm so excited to be here and with such an illustrious panel. So let me set a few ground rules so we can have some question and answers, which I'm sure everybody wants to get to. What my plan is I'm going to be introducing our three professionals representing the fields of law, business, and medicine. I will call our first panelist who will speak for 10 minutes. I will give them a 2-minute warning to wrap up their comments. And then we will move on to their next panelist. And I apologize to everyone. I'm going to be kind of brief in the introduction, but as they speak and you get to know them, I'm sure you'll learn all about them. And I know that you're all capable of Googling them later and learning all about their accolades. But let me start with the field of law. And I would like to introduce Professor Daniel B. Rodriguez, who attended California State University at Long Beach as an undergraduate, which anybody from Chicago is very jealous of during this month of January. And he also received his law degree with honors from Harvard University. He is a Harold Washington Professor at Northwestern University Pritzker School of Law. He served as Dean of the Law School from 2012 through 2018. He is taught as a full-time and visiting professor at a number of law schools, such as University of Texas, University of California at Berkeley, Harvard, Stanford, Columbia, the University of Southern California, and Virginia. And he was also spent time at the University of San Diego Law School, which is one of our Roman Catholic universities, and again, in a much nicer climate that we have right now here in the Chicago area. In addition, he served in numerous professional organizations, and I know that we have a lot of students here tonight, and I'll have you know that in 2014, he was president of the American Association of Law Schools. So he knows how to explain things to students, and he can really relate to students. His academic work has concentrated in the fields of administration, constitutional law, governmental law, statutory interpretation, and law and business technology interface. So without further ado, Professor Daniel Rodriguez, if you can now speak and give us some reactions to what has been presented for the case for the body in public bioethics.
Thank you so much, Rita and Carol. Can you hear me okay? So please don't Google me. That introduction was both very generous and very excessive. But I'm pleased to be here. Please don't treat my lack of going on with appreciation as anything other than wanting to keep on time, and I'll keep my remarks short because I know we want to generate conversation. First of all, just great kudos to Professor Snead for his book. If the market tells us anything, it's an extraordinary book because I had a tremendously hard time getting my hands on it. But I was able to and read it with great profit. I won't obviously talk about the public ethics, the bioethics part. That is, as I suppose they say in the military, above my pay grade. Although I found it fascinating and interesting and learned a great deal. I'll just say a very brief aside. One of my former colleagues at the University of Texas was John Robertson, who appears prominently in the book. A really interesting man who died, as you know, tragically just a couple of years ago. But here's what I want to do. I want to make 2 points. If I had more time, I'd make 3, but in the interest of time, I'll only make 2. Part of the audience, there are many audiences, and focusing on the law for Professor Snead's really interesting proposals, and they range across our legal audiences, right? Public agencies, the legislature, the courts. But I want to focus in on one entity that gets the lion's share of decision-making, and that's the United States Supreme Court. Certainly in the area of abortion, reproductive rights, to a substantial degree in the area of end-of-life care, less so in assisted reproduction. But I want to focus in on the Supreme Court. I want to focus in particularly on constitutional law arguments and make the following argument. And that is, as compelling as these arguments are at the level, and really this formulation, this framework, as he puts it, at the level of bioethics, it's a difficult audience for these kinds of arguments, because I'd suggest that constitutional law lacks an effective vocabulary to incorporate, not completely, and the ambition, of course, is to give them that vocabulary, but by tradition, by design, by history, it doesn't have a very effective vocabulary to put into place this wonderful phrase from the conclusion of Professor Snead's book, and I just want to read it, to create the networks of giving and receiving that embodied beings need to survive and flourish. And there are two reasons for that. One, let me start with the juxtaposition that is quite well known in American constitutional law and its history between so-called negative liberties and positive rights. So we teach our students in constitutional law that the US Constitution is by and large a charter of negative liberties. It is about what the government shall not or cannot do to us. So when, and Professor Snead quotes the right to be let alone as he, as far as I'm concerned, quite aptly puts it, a view of expressive individualism and atomized individuals. The rights and privileges, and here I quote again, suited to atomized individual wills who inhabit a world of strife. That's a very grim world, as I certainly agree with them, but that is very much the world that our constitutional law inhabits. So by contrast to state constitutions, which do have charters of positive rights, a right to education, a right to a clean environment, a right to, even in some state constitutions, a right to public health. Those are quite anathema to our federal constitutional tradition, for better or worse. I think I would suggest for worse, and I would humbly suggest that Professor Snead might agree with that. But nonetheless, we have that absence of a affirmative right to healthcare. And so even something like the right to life has always seemed to me an atomized notion. Not that I disagree with it, but basically the right to life stands in as a right not to be aborted, rather than something that calls along with it the kind of affirmative duties to assistance and compassion that we would aspire to in important ways. Religion hasn't been mentioned in this presentation, but let me put it squarely on the table as a Roman Catholic. I think of it as analogous to the notion of pastoral care or pastoral ministry. We have that, of course, in our church and our tradition, right, for the sick and infirm, ways that members of the body of Christ continue to minister and carry out the mission of Jesus. Psalm 23 and so many other places talks about the pastoral care. We don't really have that in law. So we don't have, as our church does, this affirmative duties and obligations that are built, that are hardwired right into our religious tradition. So in the absence of that, I would suggest that we lack the kind of vocabulary, and that's an impoverishment, to be sure, that would enable us to rise up and impose the kinds of affirmative duties, at least through constitutional law. I'm sure Professor Snead will say, well, that there are other avenues and other venues and other audiences, and I totally concede that. But it's very difficult to imagine that we have those kinds of audiences. That's point number one. Point number two is constitutional law also has an impoverished vocabulary because it is very much about balancing and about trade-offs. And so constitutional law resists absolutes. Occasionally absolutes rise up. Justice Hugo Black, of course, advocated famously absolutes in First Amendment traditions, but we don't have that by and large, and certainly including in the areas of bioethics. And again, if you'll permit me, by analogy to gospel and by analogy to our traditions, we lack the kinds of moral absolutes and compelling arguments that might be there. So I love looking at Holy Father's Pope John Paul II's encyclical from 1993, Veritatis Splendor, in which he puts squarely before us and says the following, and I quote, "It would be a very serious error to conclude that the church's teaching is essentially only an ideal, which must then be adapted, proportioned, graduated to the so-called concrete possibilities of man, according to a balancing of the goods in question." We learn from Romans 12:2, do not be conformed.
Minutes, Professor.
Okay, do not be conformed to this world. So we know from our traditions, and I mean this by analogy, I'm not suggesting the court sort of folds in religious traditions into its jurisprudence, but we know from our religious tradition that we should not be conformed to this world. But what the courts tell us in our constitutional law is we certainly should be conformed to this world. And the choices are more at the level of balancing and more at the level of trade-offs. So I'll conclude just in this way. I view Professor Snead's description and depiction, not only at an abstract level, but actually as a framework level, as providing an enormously compelling case for application of legal doctrine. But our constitutional law would have to be changed in its vocabulary and its vernacular and its theory in extraordinary ways in order to accommodate the kind of affirmative duties and obligations that we are, again, quite comfortable with, indeed embrace as children of God in our religious traditions, but the courts are quite reticent about, United States Supreme Court, across the political spectrum in the area of constitutional adjudication and jurisprudence. So I'll stop there. So, but thank you again. I really enjoyed having the opportunity to read the book.
You know, you actually have a minute and a half because I misread it.
I will yield back my, as we say in Congress, I will yield back my time.
All right, very good. And so now I'd like to move along to the field of business. And I would like to introduce our next member of the panel, and this is Harry Kramer Jr., who's a summa cum laude graduate of Lawrence University with a degree in mathematics and economics, followed by an MBA in finance and accounting from Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern. He's also a CPA. He's a professor of management and strategy at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management, where he teaches MBA and the executive MBA programs. He's an executive partner with the Madison Dearborn Partners, one of the largest private equity firms in the United States. He's a former chairman and chief executive of Baxter International Company, a well-known multi-billion-dollar global healthcare company. He's also a great teacher and was voted by his students as Professor of the Year in 2008. He and his wife, Julie, have 5 children that they have provided with 12 years of Catholic education, including the youngest one, who's a freshman at Notre Dame. Harry serves on the Chicago Archdiocese Finance Committee, School Board, and Leadership Committee, only to be outdone by his wife, Julie's board service to Mundelein Seminary, Catholic Relief Services, and the Lumen Christi Institute. Harry is also on the Board of Trustees for Northwestern University and the Conference Board of North Shore University Health System. He's been on the Board of Directors for several healthcare organizations. He's a member of the Council of CEOs, Commercial Club of Chicago, and Economics Club of Chicago. Harry's published books on values-based leadership, and his webpage has the titles and many more accolades. So welcome, Professor Kramer. You need to unmute yourself so we can hear you. There we go.
Okay. So can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
We can.
Okay. Well, I have to first say it is an absolute honor to be part of this panel with Professor Snead as well as Professor Rodriguez. And I think I've taken about 20 pages of notes, and I've got to get a copy of all of your slides. For many reasons, I find it to be very, very compelling. I listen and understand. You know, as a layperson, from some of the legal hurdles and legal issues that were talked about, I will say from a business standpoint, Carter, you lay out exactly the direction that I think we need to head. And I think there's been, and I'm an optimist about this, in the last, 20 years now, more and more students, more and more young executives realize that it isn't about the individual. It really is a way of finding out how do we work together? How do we appreciate every single person? And in my work on value-based leadership, I really truly try to get folks to think about all the things you're talking about, Carter. I talk about a couple principles. The first one being the importance of self-reflection. I think as Catholics, we call this prayer, but literally stopping to take the time to talk about some of these issues. What are my values? What's my purpose? Is this really all about me? And the amount of time and attention now I'm trying to spend with students on talking about, is this just about personal success, or is it about significance? Is this really all about my resume and all about me? Or is it about the legacy and what I leave behind? And I would say more and more younger people have started to move away from, I would say, this historic business perspective of, it's maximization of profits. It's all about the shareholder and everything else be damned. And, the individual and people are just inputs to the process. And the number of times now in classes where students will say, well, let's think about it. If the most important part of a business really is the people. Isn't it interesting when you look at a balance sheet for an organization, the people are not even on the balance sheet? And so thinking about that. And then when I think about it as a Catholic, I think, and I talk to many of my friends that may have different religions, whether they're Muslim, whether they're Jewish, whatever. I would argue, Carter, that most of my colleagues would look at this exactly the same way you do. All right. I mean, I think in our tradition, we talk about, and I try to keep this very simple so I don't confuse myself, right? I think Jesus told us, love God above all and love your neighbor as yourself. Well, I don't know how you love your neighbor as yourself if you really don't take care of people that are less fortunate than you. I don't know how you deal with the fact that, yes, those people are in their 90s and, helping them stay alive is sort of inconvenient to me. Well, I don't think it's inconvenient if you're trying to live the life. And I won't put it just as Catholics. I think most people would argue we need to do that. And I sometimes struggle with understanding why this is so difficult for us to translate to other pieces. And Julie, who I always find fascinating because she can tell me where every single Bible verse is that I can't find. But the part that I'm always reminded of when Jesus says, whatever you do to the least of my brother, you do unto me. And I'm listening to your comments, and I get a little emotional thinking about what are we thinking and how do we justify this and sort of this atomization of things. And maybe the last comment I'll make, because I really do want to make sure we have a lot of good conversation, is Professor Rodriguez said, I actually think in everything I do, Carter, I literally think and try to get people to focus on balance. It's another one of my 4 principles that everything depends on, right? Because we can talk about any topic, and when we usually do, people have very, very strong opinions, very strong opinions. The problem I find is very rarely do they understand opinions other than their own. And I always quote that St. Francis comment of, I seek to understand before I'm understood. I literally say that, Carter, every day. I seek to understand. And if I'm having a discussion with you, Carter, I will try to train myself never to say, oh, Carter, I don't understand. No, that's sort of ignorant. If I take the time, I'll understand. And then I'll decide, do I agree or disagree? And in my mind, a balance, and I was taking so many notes when you were talking, I have no problem with the fact that it is important to have individual autonomy. I actually think this whole idea of expressive individualism is what's made this country great, for 270 years. But the problem is that's only half the story. Okay, that's half the story. And I think you talk about this in the book. So I'm a little nervous where somebody says, oh, now all I care about is everybody else. I no longer care about myself. No, it's both. And so finding that middle ground, getting people to realize, you know what, it is about the individual, but part of being that individual in part of this world global community that we're here for a blink of an eye, we have a moral responsibility, as you talk about, to make a difference in the world. And that's something that I'm very proud of the fact now that at Kellogg, there's a tremendous focus on this. When I first started doing this, we would have 20 or 30 students in the class. And, now we have 120 students in every single one of these classes. And the students now, I think, are taking the view of, it isn't just about me and it isn't just about materialism, but how we do that and get to the things that you're talking about, I think is going to take a big step. And I sincerely appreciate all the things you're doing. Well, in fact, and that's coming, I'll make, Carter. I would have guessed, because I, as much as an optimist I am, I would guess that the things you're talking about, well, that's going to turn away from some people. They're not going to like it. The fact when I looked it up, your book is one of the top 10 books published in the entire year, okay, says somebody's starting to realize that what you're talking about really is important. And I sincerely thank you for that. Did I do okay, Rita, time-wise?
And you also have minutes left. So are you going to reserve them as well, just like
I do the same thing that my colleague, Dr. Rodriguez did.
Very good. And for our audience, so you know, you can type in some questions you would like to ask in the chat feature. We will not be able to answer all the questions tonight, but we would like to take a look at them and be able to ask some of those questions to our panelists. So without further ado, let me introduce our third panelist from the field of medicine, Dr. Mary Keane, who is a mother of 5 and has been married for 33 years to her husband, Chuck Kirchhoff. Mary had graduated from Northwestern University Medical School in 1979 and has 42 years of diverse experience, particularly in pediatric rehabilitation and neurodevelopmental medicine. She's affiliated with several hospitals, including Loyola University Medical School, Central DuPage Hospital, her primary-based hospital, Mary and Joy Rehabilitation Center, and now part of Northwestern. She's board certified in physical medicine and rehabilitation and pediatrics, pediatric rehabilitation, and neurodevelopmental disabilities. She was a founding board member and a former medical director of the organization Almost Home Kids. Dr. Keane has been named a top doctor by Chicago Magazine, Consumers Checkbook's Top Doctors, and Best Doctors in America by Best Doctors, Inc., as well as a Patient's Choice Award winner. She's very passionate about the patients and families that she serves, and she is especially interested in developing intentional communities of caring for all of these families. And so without further ado, Dr. Keane, please. You're muted, so we need to take you off mute.
Okay. Can everybody hear me okay?
Now we can hear you.
All right. First of all, I want to thank Professor Snead for his book, which I found fascinating and full of hope, even though as I read it, I feared that it was utopian. I'll talk more about it. I don't think it's utopian anymore, but that was my fear as I read it. After reading the book, I think I finally understand the reasoning behind Roe v. Wade and the other abortion rulings, which I've struggled to understand for almost 50 years. And I also better understand the forces behind doctor-assisted suicide movement. I also want to thank the other panelists for their comments, and I'm grateful for their reflections. I have observed families who have suffered grievously when one parent justified abandoning the family in order to pursue individual goals. They have left a lot of damage in their wake of their tragic and selfish choices. But this has been a relatively rare finding in my experience. Much more often, I am encountering families who daily live out the relationships of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving. I'd like to share just a few brief examples. Parents who dedicate their entire lives and entire livelihoods to one child with severe neurologic impairments. Parents who obtained second mortgages on their homes while working 2 full-time jobs just to pay the medical bills for their twins who spent the first 3 months of their life in neonatal intensive care. Families who split apart for weeks at a time so that a child with a disability could get intensive therapy in Australia, Poland, or Canada that they couldn't afford to get here in the United States. Parents who bring their children with CP and or autism for therapy several days a week for years. Siblings who choose healthcare careers having been inspired by their siblings or the care their siblings received in healthcare. Parents who have not had a vacation in years, nothing to do with COVID and travel restrictions, but parents who've not had a vacation in years. Parents who lovingly care for their child with autism for decades, yet the child does not recognize them as persons, much less as mom or dad. There is no grateful or graceful receiving, they're just raw expectations, and yet the parents love and give and love and give and love and give. I've also met parents who adopt 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 special needs children after having 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 of their own. Incredible generosity. And very recently I had another example of a mom who came to me and said, I am so glad that my child who has such severe impairments was born into my family, as we have the means to provide for him. So there are parents who find real fulfillment in radical self-giving. These are parents who live the Beatitudes every day. These are parents who demonstrate love made visible. These parents prove that Professor Snead's proposal is not utopian in nature. These are people who prove that radical self-gift is sustainable. Yet most of the families I serve still struggle daily with many disadvantages. But what I've seen is that the more support these people have from others, not only financial, but of time, presence, listening, emotional support, willingness to accommodate them as a family, accompanying them as a family, the more we do that, the more sustainable their life of uncalculated giving will be. Professor Snead's book has led me to modify my personal job description from caring for children with disabilities to promoting human flourishing in the context of radical dependence. Thank you so much, Professor Snead, for your book and for your presentation tonight, for panelists, and Carol for asking me to respond to this book. This reflection has helped me to realize how privileged I am to be able to work with the children and families that I serve. And that's all I have to say. I'm looking forward to hearing everybody else. Thank you.
I'd like to start with Professor Rodriguez, and I would like to ask you, given your professional background, would you implement any of the suggestions of Professor Snead in your line of work? Why or why not? And if so, how?
So let me give, as I suppose lawyers are trained to do, a bit of an elusive answer to that question, if you'll permit me. I think at the level of implementation, what I find profoundly resonant to me is, and not just at a theoretical level, but again, to use his term, at a framework level, is the attention, the refocused attention on, as he puts it, the embodied self, and considerations that are not merely the product of and born of expressive individualism. So to put a little bit of a kind of a footnote, or maybe it's a final sentence to my caution about the difficulty in appealing to a Supreme Court that is based, whose vernacular and vocabulary is based on negative liberties. If it wasn't clear, let me make it more clear. I think it would be greatly enriched if our courts, the federal courts and the state courts, turned to a very different vocabulary and really had a sense that is, again, by analogy to pastoral care, a sense of affirmative duties. And I think there would be difficult cases, and maybe Professor Snead and I would disagree at the margin with respect to some of the cases, and that's fine. But I think that the shaping of these approaches into affirmative obligations and affirmative duties that are recognized by law, as much as it is in tension with our constitutional traditions and constitutional history, has very strong support, not only in his argument, but as he well knows, in a whole plethora of thinkers, including legal thinkers, who are writing about some Catholic, some like Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine and others not, but it's a tradition that goes back a long way. So it is new and novel to be on the one hand, but is also deeply embedded in how traditions of law that go back a long way. So that's not a full answer to your question, but so I'd say yes, I would implement the framework, and we could live to argue another day about the implementation of particular proposals and policies.
Okay, so moving to a business model, Professor Kramer, given the business background and your teaching in your classes, what, if any, of Professor Snead's recommendations would you teach, take in, discuss with your students?
I would take all of them in, and in fact, one of the first things I want to do is find out from Professor Snead whether you've got like a summary article. I'll assign it to the 120 people this coming Wednesday, because I think it's exactly the kind of thing they ought to be thinking and talking about. So it's exactly the kind of things that would fit in perfectly, right? To get people to think about what are our obligations and what should we be doing differently. So yes.
And Dr. Keane, I know that you said you have changed your job description as a result of this book. Are there any other changes you would make or information you would share with your colleagues in your line of work?
I will be sharing the book with others for sure, and recommending the book highly. I'll pass the book on along to my partner to start. But everybody I work with works with individuals with profound disabilities, and I think that they will enjoy and appreciate this perspective, that we are all on the spectrum of disability, and everybody I work with is working with people who have radical permanent dependence on others. So it's just so important. It really does address what we do every day. Thank you.
Sure. So I have a question for Professor Snead. So the question so far from our audience, it looks like you've been preaching to the choir. Please describe how you engage in conversation with those that disagree with your analysis and your proposal for remembering the body.
So thank you. First of all, I want to thank Professor Rodriguez and Professor Kramer and Dr. Keane for such very thoughtful interventions, and a lot to think about. And I just want to appreciate it. Maybe I'll have a chance to offer a brief response to those in a little bit, but I want to answer your question that you just asked me. And this actually goes to something that Professor Kramer was saying, which is to say, to take seriously, and this is something that I do imperfectly, obviously, and to take seriously the idea that we all belong to one another, as Mother Teresa said. Mother Teresa said that if we don't have peace in the world, it's because we've forgotten that we belong to one another. And that's an even more beautiful and inspired way of saying what I try to say in a 300 and whatever page book. Is the fundamental insight is that by virtue of our embodiment, we're made for love and friendship. And what that means, and Professor Kramer was talking about, how do you talk to people when you internalize the proposition that this is a fellow human being. This is your neighbor, in the sense of love your neighbor as yourself. This is your neighbor, this person that disagrees with you, this person that might be angry at you because they disagree so strongly with what you're saying, because they think you're trying to take away an important right that they have, or that you're judging them, or something like that, right? And it seems to me that the first order of business when you're engaging in conversation with someone who disagrees strongly is to really internally orient yourself to actually loving that person, to say, you know what, and especially, and as hard as that is, right? And I'm not trying to be Pollyannish about it. As hard as it is to say, this is my fellow human being made in the image and likeness of God, who has intrinsic equal dignity, the same as me. And this is my neighbor. And the way I treat, and this Dorothy Day says, you love God as much as you treat your worst enemy, right? And so this is somebody that I have to, this person is actually Jesus to me in our encounter. And so I have to accord that person the love and unconditional love that they're entitled to. And it seems to me, and this is not a strategic or a tactical suggestion, but I think that that's really the only way you could actually soften a person's heart. That's the only way that you can break this terrible polarization that we have right now in our society, that's amplified by the balkanization of people into thick bubbles and social media, and our politics is broken and people are at each other's throats. It seems to me that my first order of business, just like the church's first order of business when they go out, is to feed people and to clothe them and to cure them and to care for them. You do that you don't do that because they agree with you. You don't do that because, and it seems to me that genuine friendship is the only pathway. Now, obviously arguments, I live in the world of arguments. We all do. Elegant arguments supported by facts, supported by logic, supported by reasoning, but it all has to be through the lens of charity. It all has to be through the lens of charity and mercy and love to the person that's in front of you. And that means especially people who think things and do things that I find that I don't agree with. And I feel like if a person is going to really be in a position to hear what I'm saying, they need to know that I believe it. And if I'm not treating them with the love and respect that they're entitled to as my neighbor, then I'm a hypocrite. You know what I mean? And I'm sure that I fail all the time, right? I fail internally when I'm imagining people I disagree with. I fail when I'm in arguments. I fail. But the only way to actually get purchase with another person is to genuinely treat them as a neighbor that you love and care for unconditionally. And that's where I try to start. And look, I have a lot of friends that disagree strongly with me on these questions, people who are passionate about abortion rights, people who are passionate about maximal reproductive freedom, people who are passionate about autonomy at the end of life. But we care about each other, you know what I mean? And we hear each other and we are walking together. And I hope and I try to, and as Harry said, I have to listen to them too, with charity, and to try to not be arrogant and not to think that I already know the answer to all these questions, but committed to these fundamental principles.
I also have another current question for you, Professor Snead, from the audience, and they want to know if you could comment on expressive individualism and the paucity from your book, the words of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving in the context of COVID, and the means we have to protect each other, perhaps by masking, and ourselves, again, perhaps by social distancing. Right. And now with vaccine allocation during the early phases when there's not enough to go around, nor the public health infrastructure to dispense it.
Yeah, no, that's a really excellent question. And it's a question that I discussed in an interview with Ramesh Ponnuru on Bloomberg not long ago. So my measurement for the success of public policy and law is, to what extent is it contributing to the sustainability, the shoring up, the strengthening, and the promoting of these networks of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving upon which we all depend for our survival and for learning to become the thing that we're supposed to be, which is someone who can make the good of another our own good. And again, I don't presuppose what legal mechanisms are. I mean, it could be the case that the wisest thing to do at a particular time or place is for the law to allow for private ordering to do those things, and through the mechanisms of civil society. But turning to the question of COVID and the pandemic, my own view is like, so what, in terms of vaccine allocation, what kinds of policies are best for shoring up these networks of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving? And I come up with something that is, something like the preferential option for the vulnerable, I think, and operationalized by seeking out those who are weakest and most vulnerable, doing the things that are most beneficial for them, vaccinating those people that are most at risk, vaccinating the people that take care for them, so take care of them, so you're covering both ends, those that are engaged in the uncalculated giving as well as those engaged in the graceful receiving. And in our own judgment, to really try to think carefully about what can I do, not just to protect other people from germs or from me, but also to signal to other people that they're safe around me. You know what I mean? And I think that's where we might not like masks. We might feel constrained by masks, but I feel like what we need to do is to, in my judgment, and I'm not a public health expert, I'm not an epidemiology expert, but my view is that even just as a signal to and not a virtue signal, but a genuine signal of charity and concern for others, you want to make people feel comfortable and not anxious. And so if that means me wearing a mask, if it's uncomfortable or whatever, if I've tested negative, I'm just going to put the mask on. You know what I mean? And it seems to me, why don't you just wear the mask? And so I think masking is important, social distancing is important, and vaccine allocation, prioritizing those who are the weakest and most vulnerable, and avoiding the temptation to serve those that are most productive, right? To serve those that are most value producing to serve those who are weak and vulnerable and to serve those that take care of them. That's a very abstract answer, but that's where I land.
I want to kind of go through a concrete example. I know we have students in the audience, and when we have interdisciplinary programs, we'd like to see how does, the medical field relate to the legal field and the business field. And so an example I would like to go into is sometimes in hospitals, there are ethics committees, and some may have about laws in some states where they have futility, and the boards may meet and try to decide if the treatment given to, it could be a child with a very serious genetic condition where they're still being treated. They may still have eye contact and interaction. There's a case out in, I think, Texas right now where a child has been on paralytics basically since birth, and she's been through so much litigation, but she's going on her second birthday, and her care has cost millions of dollars. And the mother is a single mother, and she's working 2 jobs, and the hospital feels like they're the ones with her most of the time, and that even a diaper change hurts. So my question, going back to the panelists, should there be medical futility laws? And I know that Professor Rodriguez, you work in statutory, construction and government policy. Dr. Kramer, you've been on several hospital boards and healthcare. And of course, Dr. Keane, you're in the trenches with exactly that kind of population. So again, I'm going to start with Professor Rodriguez, and if maybe you could talk a little bit about how you would interact with other colleagues in these different professions and what you think about medical futility laws.
Well, I defer to the great expertise of my other panelists, especially Dr. Keane, who's worked on the front lines of this. So I should have appropriate humility and do. So I'll just simply look at one aspect. And Dr. Snead, Professor Snead mentioned this. I worry about, particularly focusing on the end of life, about compulsion. And I'd be very interested in Dr. Keene's views of this. It seems to me that the rise of DNRs and end of life orders might reflect something that we as a society should really be looking at, is the ways in which do not resuscitate orders might reflect judgments of doctors and judgments of society and judgments of taking less seriously those at the end of their life. And that's hard to measure. And the law recognizes sort of free will and informed consent. But I worry that in our informed consent laws do a poor job at really protecting and excavating. And I think Carter said that in his presentation. If we look at the disparate impact and look at the populations, we'll just see, I suspect, greater numbers of people of color, the poor, the vulnerable, or whatever, who are signing do not resuscitate orders and succumbing to end of life pressures. At least I worry about that. Empirically, maybe I'm making that up, but I don't think so.
Dr. Keane, if you could step in and give us your thoughts and reaction.
Well, first, I don't like that word futile case. There are no such thing as futile cases. There may be care that's not helpful, but no patient is futile. No case is futile. In my experience in many hospitals, and I've been on the ethics committee at Mary Joy for 20 some years now, ethics committees can be tremendously helpful to families and their patients by helping to clarify what are goals of care. Now, I've also encountered episodes where a ethics committee, by isolating from the patient and the family and being in the bedside where discussion and decisions don't include family members, there often is too much of an emphasis, in my opinion, on this expressive individualism rather than the context of the patient. But in my many years of experience, almost always the ethics committees are extremely helpful in changing the focus to what are the goals of care? How can we help this individual in this particular time in their life?
And before I go on to Professor Kramer, can you comment at all, Dr. Kane, in your experience or with the committees, how much is medical care costs a factor, or should they be a factor in decision making?
Well, in our ethics committees at Mary and Joy, it does come up. We are not allowed to keep patients as long as we want to. Insurance companies are breathing down our necks every day. No, if your patient isn't making up progress, you've got to get them out. And even if they're not, we have been a Catholic hospital. Our tradition is Catholic, even though we no longer are actually a Catholic hospital. We have been taught and have ingrained to consider responsibility to stewardship, and that when we provide care, we want it to be the right amount of care to the right person, because we don't have enough to go around. It is often a painful discussion, and we suffer at facing the injustice of insurance limitations. You know, there are times when we really want to have patients stay longer, but we can't give totally free care indefinitely. We give lots and lots of free care, but we can't give free care indefinitely. So it's a very painful real life situation for all of us.
And Professor Kramer, if you can speak in your experience in working with, you know, corporations and costs, how much should that factor into decisions on medical care?
Well, I think, you know, cost always comes up. It's always an issue for sure. But I guess my view of it is, in terms of when you have to make a decision, I try to always boil it down to two things. Always, you know, what's the right thing to do, and we'll do the best we can do. And when I say we'll do what's the right thing to do, I'll say, well, I'm not bright enough to figure that out by myself, so I better get a collection of very, very strong, values-driven people. And I usually think of it at the end of the day, you know, what would Christ want us to do? What would he expect us to do, right? So I like Professor Keene's comment, Dr. Keene's comment of there's no such thing as futile, because I think, I don't know where, but I think Christ actually brought people back from the dead. Okay, so this whole idea that something, it can't be reversed, I don't believe it. I believe it can. And how we pay for it, I think, is an issue. How we deal with it is an issue. But in my mind, if you actually believe nothing is more important than human life, and you think about all the things that Carter's talked about for the last hour and a half, I think we have an obligation to try to do it, particularly in the world's wealthiest country. Right? This may be something in very, very poor countries, but when you're the world's wealthiest country and we can't figure out how to do it, something tells me something's mixed up. Because I can't think of any logical reason, you know, when we're spending trillions of dollars on other things, we can't figure out a way to do this. But that's my personal view.
And circling back to Professor Snead as to whether or not, like, there should be laws on things like if there's, you know, medical care, if there should be costs, if there should be committees making a decision. The audience wants to know, from a practical perspective, what's the best way to implement the law in your paradigm of affirmative obligations we have to one another? Should it be legislation at the state level, at the federal level, through the United States Supreme Court jurisprudence, starting with changing hearts and minds?
Yeah, I think that, well, I think there should always be legal and cultural change that proceed in parallel to one another. I think the law has an extraordinary pedagogical function, as I discussed in my talk. It, for better or worse, teaches people about principles of justice, about concepts of equality, of freedom, what we owe to each other, the common good. But we also have to use all of the cultural organs we have, including just our interactions with our loved ones and others that we come into contact with. As far as which branch of government, I mean, this actually relates back to something that Dan was saying at the very beginning, which I think is really important. I couldn't agree more that well, I'll put it this way. I think the Supreme Court is, when it's operating appropriately, is constrained by the text, history, and tradition of the Constitution. And I think that what that means is that gives it a certain, that limits its capacity to act in a flexible way as would the political branches of government. And so in the context of assisted reproduction and end-of-life decision-making, we're in a pretty good place where we can, working together through the deliberative processes of our country, to come up with political solutions for policy and legal solutions that I think are grounded and reflect and respond to the genuine needs of a person in all of their complexity, including their embodiment. One of the deep problems, though, in the context of the jurisprudence of abortion is that the court itself constrains the political branches in a way that I personally don't find persuasive in terms of the reasoning of Justice Blackmun and Roe or the plurality in Planned Parenthood versus Casey. I think that the court is importing a vocabulary in those cases to try to frame the question at issue, to try to frame the protected liberty interest, to try to frame the state's interest. I think that they're actually importing a lot of different things that are not drawn from the text, history, and tradition of the Constitution itself. And that's why it goes off the rails. And it's a shame that those decisions have shackled the political branches from having the flexibility to come up with genuine, humane reactions, wise, just humane reactions to the crisis that in which abortion is considered. And I'm encouraged that in June Medical Services, the latest case that we have, Chief Justice Roberts says explicitly that he thinks as a matter of institutional competence, the court cannot balance the incommensurable goods that it seeks to in terms of the freedom and self-determination of a woman in a crisis pregnancy versus the state's interest in nascent human life or life in the living human being in utero and all the other goods that the state seeks to vindicate the integrity of the medical profession, or to try to prevent a coarsening of the moral sense, or to try to encourage respect for life more generally. I take that as a signal that Chief Justice Roberts is not persuaded that the project that Justice Blackmun began, and that you can see in Justice Kennedy's language and the mystery of life passage in Casey, or for that matter in the late Justice Ginsburg's language about how abortion is a mechanism of a woman realizing her equal status in the social and economic life of the country. I think there's some signs that we at least have justices that see that that's kind of a problem. We have a lot of complicated questions involving stare decisis and those kinds of issues. But I think actually, by way of agreeing with Dan's observation about the Supreme Court and its restrained role, is that I think one of the problems in abortion jurisprudence is the Supreme Court exceeded its authority in those ways and arrogated to itself of a lexicon and a vocabulary that was not emerging from the text, history, and tradition of the Constitution itself.
Can I add something very short? Rita, is that okay?
Oh, absolutely.
Maybe just a footnote. I predict, and this is not a novel prediction, that we're probably going to see, at least even if it's just in a narrow holding, Roe versus Wade overturned. But then we have two really big challenges. One is we're not writing on a blank slate, right? We're writing against the background of how these issues have been framed by the court. So the absence of Roe versus Wade as a precedent is enabling for those who would look to move abortion jurisprudence in a different way, but it's still framed in a way that requires serious interrogation and serious change. The second point I would make goes back to Professor Kramer's point in the exchange about Christian charity, and he characterized it better than I'm going to be, but about walking in the shoes of Jesus and understanding the empathy that comes from both sides. We're going to need huge buckets of empathy. Yeah. and respect, given how polarized issues are about abortion, when we undertake the task, which I think will be a welcome task, to rebuild, rescaffold what our jurisprudence and our legal standards will be after Roe versus Wade is overturned, which I think is a question of when rather than whether. Yeah,
I agree with all of that.
And I really am hopeful because we have youth here today, we have students here today, and I would like to have everybody kind of go through some closing remarks. And starting with Professor Snead, I noticed that in every chapter of your book, and it is a wonderful book, I will also recommend the online version because it is so well researched. You can click on the references, so you can go right to the sources many times if you get the online version of the book. But it's graduate students and it's writers and authors that have shaped our policies that we have today. And if we don't publish and put out, new information, I think that publishing, and you can all comment on this, leads to policy and leads to change. So what would you say to the students and professionals in our audience to take away from tonight's seminar? If you could give some closing remarks, and then I'll have the panelists do it as well.
No, I'm going to keep this very short. I mean, I'm just grateful for first of all, the participation of these wonderful panelists taking the time and expertise to comment on the book. That's very humbling, and I'm very grateful for that. As far as the students are concerned, it's very simple. It's you need to take care of each other, and you need to take that seriously. You need to understand that you are your neighbor's keeper, and that doesn't just mean that you have unchosen obligations. It means that you have unearned privileges and we are all due to come to one another's aid, and to make sure that we genuinely make the good of others our own good.
Professor Kramer, closing remarks.
Well, as I said earlier, it's just been an honor to participate in this. Related to the students, I guess the way I would sort of characterize it is that there's a big challenge here that Professor Snead's talking about. And I often will say in class that when you have all these issues, and it can be any one of these issues, it can be this, it can be global poverty, global healthcare, digital divide, and we usually talk about the group of people that's going to solve these things. And we always seem to come back to the same group of people that's going to solve them. It's this famous group of people I refer to in class, Carter, as those guys. There's some infamous group somewhere. And I always like to say, well, wait a minute, this is a gender neutral term. We are those guys. And I keep telling all the students, rather than just talking about the issues, what are you going to do if you agree that this is what we need to change through your example? And I think you said it, Carter. Your example, people will watch what you say, but they will really find out and do what you do. And so I think there's an enormous obligation on the part of all of us through our example to realize, hey, we're one of those guys. Let's get out and do something about it. That's what I would argue.
Dr. Keane, closing remarks, please.
I would just like to echo what everybody else has said and mention that there is an organization called the Folklore Movement that came out of Italy and is now all around the world.
Could you say that again slowly, what the name of that movement is?
Folklore, F-O-C-A-L-A-R-E. I'm not sure how to spell it, but it came out of Italy right after World War II. And one of their primary tenets is be the first to love. Be the first to love. And I think several people have said that tonight, but that's a short way to say it. Thank you, everybody.
Professor Rodriguez.
Well, I want to thank everyone and really appreciate being part of this. To your question, Rita, about students, if I may focus on law students in particular, we have now in our law schools, in Carter's law school and my law school and so many others, organizations that weren't around when I was a law student back in the Stone Ages, but are really emerged as really important advocacy groups and opportunities for discussion. St. Thomas More societies, which I've had the opportunity to work with at a number of schools. Christian Legal Society is another. The Federal Society, which is just sort of birthed when I was a law student. I had the good fortune to be the student advisor at Berkeley of the Federal Society. It's there. The American Constitution Society as another organization. There's a diverse, eclectic, even ecumenical group of student organizations that really are wonderful places for spirited debate and reflection, but also in the case of some of the organizations I mentioned, spirited advocacy. And I think it's really, really important for students to find not only their niche, but find their organizations and really, really help put into practice what some of these proposals are, or if they take an opposite point of view, stand against these reforms. That's what pluralism in this society is about.
And I too would like to thank all of you. It's been great conversation tonight, and I don't want to forget to thank Carol, who put together such a wonderful panel. And Carol herself is very interesting with her ministry work, and it's the different fields of ministry, of law, of business, of social work. We do come together sometimes, and sometimes we're all members on those ethics committees at the hospital, having to make decisions and to work interdisciplinary wise. And I just encourage you, if you happen to be a student on that Northwestern campus, to go to Carol, who's open to students in law and medicine, and probably she would take the business students too. So thank you very much, Carol, for this time.
Thank you so much for your kind words. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us this evening. Professor Snead, Dean Rodriguez, Professor Kramer, Dr. Keane, and you also, Rita. It's been truly an illuminating discussion of Professor Snead's rich embodied approach to public bioethics. Thanks also to our audience and to our co-sponsors, the Lumen Christi Institute, the Catholic Lawyers Guild, the Christian Legal Society, the Catholic Physicians Guild, our Catholic student organizations at the professional schools of law, medicine, and business. I'd like to thank especially Father Kevin for his wisdom in suggesting this discussion across the professional disciplines for the flourishing of human relationships at Northwestern and beyond. Good night, everyone. Thank you for coming.
Night.
Thanks, Professor Snead. That's wonderful. That's great. And thank you, Father Kevin.
Thanks, Carol.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great to meet you, Professor Rodriguez and Dr. Nice to meet you folks.